All right. Well, good to have you all with us this morning. I have a very special day planned for you. Of course, every Sunday is a special day. Right now, we're going to dismiss the first, second, and third graders. You can go to your class at this time. The fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, you can head to your class. No, they had a great time yesterday at the children's rally and at Greater Portland Baptist Church. We're going to hear a little more about that tonight. Some of them. We had a preacher boy that actually came in first place. We had one of our girls did a Sunday school lesson, also got first place. So we're gonna have them do that tonight. So you want to come back for the evening service tonight, and then let's see the teens. You can be dismissed to your class at this time, 7th through the 12th graders. Adults, you can go ahead and be seated. We have with us a special guest today. Someone who's become a friend of mine just through vacations. Actually, you know, when you go on vacation, you should still go to church. And actually, before we hit the Big Island, Josh and Sarah hit the Big Island and told us about the church there in Kona. So a couple weeks later, my wife and we went, and then we just really struck up a friendship with the Dierkings, and actually have had the opportunity to go there and to fill in for him. And man, what a lot of work that was, and just a huge sacrifice to go to Hawaii and fill in. Actually, we enjoyed it very much. It was just a great time. And brother Dierking is in a house where you just go out in the backyard and you just see the ocean every single day. It's just absolutely breathtaking. It's beautiful. It's funny how Hawaiians come here to Oregon and say, man, it's so beautiful here. And then we go to Hawaii and say, wow, it's beautiful here. It's a different beauty, but it's good to have them with us. And, you know, Hawaii truly is a mission field. And Hawaii is, there's a huge push. And, you know, we see it all across the country, but there's really a huge push there in Hawaii to go back to the paganism that, of course, dare I say, plagued the islands at one time before missionaries actually came, and before it became part of the United States of America. And so there's a huge spiritual battle going on there in Hawaii, and of course we are aware of that, and it certainly is a mission field, and thankful for people that are willing to not just to vacation there, but actually to go there and to try to lead people to Christ, to start churches. And so Brother Dierking is with us. He's going to be with us all day. And so I'm going to go ahead and allow him to come up. He says he's got 4 hours worth of material. We're only giving him 3 services to do it in. So we need to get started. So Brother Dierking, why don't you come on up? Good to have you and your wife with us, and thank you so much for choosing Corridor Baptist Church to be with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be with you here in Oregon. We get a lot of visitors from Oregon and Hawaii. If you would, let's turn to 1 Peter and to Daniel this morning. Let me just say, Hawaii may be beautiful, but it's a long way away from everybody. And you think it's living in paradise when you don't see your children for years at a time, and you can't really go anywhere. Think about it, 2,000 miles out in the middle of the ocean. Where can you go? And it is a needy field. We did not choose it. God chose it for us. And so don't think that I'm living the life of a whatever, but Hawaii is a difficult field. This morning, I'm going to have us look at a little bit in the life of Daniel and how he was able to thrive even under severe government persecution. I chose this topic because of the new leaders that are in our own government who wish to establish a new moral code for our country that's not based on the Bible. I don't know if you heard, but just this past week, a new executive order was given that our embassies around the world can fly underneath the American flag, the gay flag. Why even mess with that? especially in countries where that is still considered a sin and abominable to God. And here America is going to fly that flag around the world. A different agenda, a different moral code that our leaders have than we have had for the past 240 years in America. One thing we know about Daniel is that around 15 years of age, and for the rest of his life, he was under a government that was ready at any time to kill him for his beliefs. Think about it. Not only was he taken by force to a new land as a teenager, to a new country, new language, new customs, but Daniel, as far as we can tell, was persecuted even further under a powerful, ungodly, pagan king and a pagan kingdom that demanded obedience to the state or suffer the consequences. In fact, perhaps Daniel and his being in Babylon as an exile is probably the greatest example of government persecution on God's children in the Bible. And so he stands as maybe an example for us today. How do we survive if persecution comes? And by the way, it's just around the corner. When I was in New York City, the House had passed a law that permitted gay marriage, and the governor was ready to sign it, but there were two senators that would not give the majority to that bill, and there was no religious exemption. So if a gay couple came to me as a pastor and wanted to be married, and I said no, I'd be in jail. I was 2 votes away from going to jail. Then we moved to Hawaii, and the same thing happened. And in a quickly called meeting just before Christmas, the governor had the houses get together, and they passed the gay marriage bill, and at the last minute they included the religious exemption, again, almost in jail. And that was before we got what we have today. Folks, we're looking at great potential persecution here in America. But Daniel is probably the greatest example of governmental persecution of God's children. So the question is this: what did Daniel do under that persecution while in a foreign land that made him so successful and actually influential during that time? If you studied the book of Daniel before, then you know that the book of Daniel's main goal is to show that God has power and he protects his children even in the darkest hours. It's a great book. And guess what? Despite what TV preachers may say today about being able to take authority over your circumstances, Daniel was never delivered from that persecution. In fact, he spent about 70 years in Babylon, the rest of his life in a foreign land. At times he was taken to the place of execution by the most powerful pagan government at that time. What is interesting about Daniel is that he knew when to stand up and when not to. For instance, right off the bat, after arriving in Babylon, they gave Daniel a new pagan name. They gave him a secular education. He couldn't stop that. He allowed that. But when it came to his duty to God, to his obedience to the word of God, Daniel stood up and he said, no, I can't do that. Reminds me of the Christian baker who would not use his artistry to make gay decorations on a cake that was ordered by a gay couple here in America. Reminds me of the Christian couple who ran out their property in New York for weddings, and they said no to gay marriage, and government fell down on them. Reminds me of the county clerk in Kentucky that would not sign a gay wedding registration. In all these cases, they suffered because of rules of government. For Daniel, there was a time when Daniel said, you may call me what you want, you may educate me as you want, you may take away many of my freedoms, but I'm still going to obey God. When it comes down to you telling me I can't do what I ought to do before God, then I say no. I'll not eat what the king says to eat. I'll not stop praying to God, even if you tell me I cannot. So this morning, in the morning message, we're going to actually look at what I call in the New Testament as the New Testament primer on how to live under state persecution. There's actually a book in the Bible that was written for that purpose, and we'll see that in the morning service. But for this time right now, let's look at how Daniel survived and even thrived in extreme governmental persecution. As a matter of background, we know that Daniel was taken to Babylon in 605 BC under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Not only that, but we read this in Jeremiah 13 and elsewhere that after him there was the evil king Marduk that followed and ruled in Babylon in 562. After that, in 560, Nergal-Shalazar ruled for 4 years. Then Labora-Zorakad ruled in 556 for 9 months. Following him, Nabonidus began his rule in 555. He followed finally by a name that we all may be familiar with, and that's Belshazzar, who began ruling in 539. And then the kingdom fell, and Babylon now becomes part of the Persian Empire. And Daniel then worked under 2 other kings, Darius and Cyrus. That means that Daniel lived in his integrity before God, and that God blessed and protected him under 8 different kings, pagan kings, and 2 different empires. And yet he stood for God all that time and would not back down. Now that took guts, you know. Thank God he did that. And what we see is that Daniel's significance is not found in the titles that he was given during that time, but Daniel's significance was his testimony, a testimony of a life of separation unto the God of heaven. In fact, we could point to a number of simple principles behind Daniel's success, principles that are also found in 1 Peter, and we're going to try and connect those 2 in the morning service and maybe a little bit this morning. Probably the principle that sticks out the most concerning Daniel is that he lived a consecrated life to God. God was number 1. Right at the beginning of the book of Daniel, we see how Daniel acted to please God, even though he was only in his teens, a teenager. So even when he was one of those who were being groomed to serve the king, which included eating the king's meat, Daniel knew that he could not do so because it was against the laws that God had given the Jewish people. We see Daniel right from the first does not compromise his biblical convictions to government. He just won't do it, even to the smallest degree. Of course, it'd be very tempting to compromise. In fact, you know, he could have told himself, well, you know, I'm a slave. I'm not really not in control here. So, you know, God, you're going to make an exception here. I'll eat what I'm not supposed to eat because the king says so. God, you'll understand that. Not only that, but if you remember the story of Daniel, we'll read a little bit here in a minute. He didn't take a combative stand. He instead makes an appeal, asking that he might not defile himself. And even when the chief eunuch says the first time, no, you can't do that, he comes back with another appeal. And he asked for a 10-day test, if you remember, the chief eunuch, and he granted that request. You may ask, why was that request granted? Well, probably because his approach was not rebellious or openly confrontational. In fact, you might call it showing respect to government. And if you would, let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2. Daniel did what was outlined for us in 1 Peter, which is interesting. 1 Peter wasn't written when Daniel was alive. But we have instructions on how to live under persecution. And that's in the book of 1 Peter. And if you notice in verse 17, God tells Peter to write this: honor all men, show respect, no matter who it is. Honor all men, respect all men. And then he says, love the brotherhood. That'd be, of course, especially God's people. And then I believe we have here an order of loyalty that is given to the Christian. Because we read next, fear God. You see that? Fear God. And then what follows after you fear God? Honor the king. Show respect to the king. But he's a pagan. Show respect to the king, God says. Number 1, you need to fear God, and then you show respect. But how can I show respect to this president or that president? Show respect, God says. That verse is what we see Daniel doing, even at maybe 15 years of age in a foreign land, where he's being asked to violate what some consider a minor conviction, he still shows respect. He honors the king. And what was the result? Now let's go back to Daniel chapter 1, okay? We'll be going back and forth. Because Daniel did right in the small thing, he didn't compromise even one little bit in his convictions to God, God blessed him. Look what it says in verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Only God could do that. Daniel was behaving just like God told Peter to have us behave in the New Testament. And that resulted in this chief eunuch listening to him. The point is this, you and I need to do right. Just do right, even in times of persecution, and let the outcome be in the hands of God. If you study 1 Peter, you'll see that right in the opening of the book, in the first 12 verses, it tells us some wonderful things about God, what God has done for us. And then we read in verses 13 and following, immediately God has Peter write, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. In other words, this is serious business, what I'm going to tell you. Yes, for 12 verses, let's worship God for all he's done. But then verse 13 comes along, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. And right away, with instruction after instruction after instruction, the rest of the book is all about instructions, how to live under persecution. Again, in 1 Peter 1:13, let me read that. Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And then notice it says, as obedient children. Verse 1, it talks about them being exiled, but he says you still need to be obedient children. You still got to obey God, even under persecution. As obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance, but as he which has called you is holy, so be holy in all manner of conversation. If Daniel had written down why he did what he did, I have a hunch he'd almost write verse 14 down. That's the testimony of Daniel. I'm going to be obedient. I'm not going to fashion my life according to the world around me. I'm not going to do it. Rather, I'm going to be holy, holy unto God in all manner of lifestyle and conversation. No matter what, God tells us and tells anyone that's under persecution that we need to be continually bold in our lifestyle that pleases him. Don't back down. Do what's right. And we see that, of course, in the life of Daniel. In fact, if you would, let's follow down. Look at verse 14, 1 Peter. From verse 14 on, there are 92 more verses in 1 Peter. 92 verses of instructions on how to live holy, even in the midst of trials and persecutions and adversities. 92 verses of instruction. And you know what? Daniel kept all of them without knowing this book was going to be written one day. It's amazing. In 1 Peter, we have the instructions on how to react and relate to government, even evil governments. We have the instructions on how to get along with fellow citizens, no matter where we live. We have instructions on how to get along with fellow Christians. And folks, we better get along together if we're under persecution. We even have instructions on how to have a happy home and get along in marriage. I think that we could say even in times of trouble, whether it be trouble from the inside or trouble from the outside by government or trouble from our neighbors or whatever, we need to just do right, God says. Here's an instruction book, how to live. Notice what it says in verse 15 of 1 Peter 1. But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. In everything you do in life, be holy unto God. Don't give in to the government. Daniel desired to remain holy before his God. He decided to put God first. He did what verse 15 says. He didn't stop and say, well, you know what, it's the king's meat and I better do it or there's bigger battles to fight. No, there's not. We read later in Daniel that he'd actually received the death penalty in a lion's den because he would continue to pray to God in an open place. And guess what? Because Daniel did what was right, God used Daniel in a mighty way under all of those kings and under two different empires. In fact, if you look back at Daniel 1, verse 17, we read this. He says, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Do you think that would have happened if Daniel had just kind of decided to fit in and disobey God? Do you think God would have given him those abilities? No. You know the story. Over time, Daniel became a respected counselor in the Babylonian kingdom, as well as in the Persian kingdom that followed. In fact, in chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and it was Daniel who answered and told him the meaning of that dream. The point is this: had Daniel's life been inconsistent, if he had not decided to continue to do right, even in the small convictions of God, even in times of persecution, God would not have used him. He would just have been a low-level slave like all the others. But because of his stand for God and God's word, Daniel eventually became number 2 in the kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar's chief advisor and overseer. The bottom line is that Daniel made correct choices by doing what was right in the sight of God, even under the threat of persecution, as Daniel lived by making the choice to live by biblical convictions over the temptations of compromise. What Daniel had, we could call, is spiritual optimism in the midst of persecution. In fact, let's read about that. Look at chapter 2, verse 20. Daniel had a spiritual optimism even when he was terribly persecuted. Daniel 2:20 says this: Daniel answered and said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his." I don't need to worry about what happens. I just do what's right. God's wisdom is greater than mine. His might is greater than Nebuchadnezzar's. Verse 21, and he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. By the way, I believe that. Do you? I believe our current leadership in Washington and in our state in Hawaii and wherever else is put there by God. He knows what he's doing. I don't, but he knows. And Daniel had that optimism. He changeth the times and seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth in him. I thank thee and praise thee, O God of my fathers, who hath given me wisdom and might, and hath made known unto me now what is desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. He had an optimism in spite of persecution. Rather than compromise, Daniel had an optimism based on God's truth, that God was in control even in times of adversity. By the way, after going through the election season that we just had, and after seeing the cabinet and the department heads that are now our leaders for the next few years, I think we can agree that God is allowing things to change in a direction. It doesn't make sense why, but it's happening, folks. Only God can be in control of what's going on. God is doing something. It could be he's getting ready for the rapture, for the tribulation, when man's going to rule it all, when the world will become one world order, like so many now in power want, to make America change it from what it is based upon the Bible and godly principles to some kind of new world order. God's doing something. It's going to happen, folks, one way or another. In fact, it's kind of exciting to see actually live at that time where it might just be working out that way right now. God's doing something. But besides optimism, we also see that Daniel was aided by having some good friends. And this is really important during persecution. It's important that you all get together and love each other and know who each other are and support each other, encourage each other. If you would go back to 1 Peter. In 1 Peter, God had Peter speak about the unity that persecutions ought to have. In fact, at least 6 times in 5 chapters, he talks about Christians. You ought to love one another. You ought to get along together. You ought not be malicious to one another. You just need each other. In fact, if you look at the very last verse, and we're going to preach on that in Sunday morning service, if I'm allowed to. 1 Peter 5:14, greet one another with a kiss of charity. Do you see that? The very last instruction. To a persecuted, you would think it'd be like, hang in there. Now, it's greet one another with a kiss of charity. Pointing out how foolish we are sometimes when we don't get along with each other. When there's people in the church that we don't say anything but hi to once in a while. Or we sit on the other side of the church to avoid others. That's not what God wants, folks. Likewise, back in chapter 1, if you would, he says there in verse 22 that we need to develop an unfeigned love for the brethren. Not a false love, but somehow in my heart, I need to love those whom I really don't love right now. Have an unfeigned love for the brethren, verse 22. And then also that we're to see that you love one another with a pure heart. Folks, if there's anybody in this church that you don't get along with, you better develop an unfeigned love for that person. Find out how to change your heart so you can love them. God says that's what you got to do when you're going through hard times. By the way, if you look over in chapter 2, verse 9, he tells the recipients of this letter that they together are not to consider themselves as lone wolves in the battle. He says in verse 9, but ye, that's plural. That is all of you. Don't think you're on your own. No, ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, listen to this, a holy nation, a peculiar people, a special people for God, that ye, all of you, should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And then he says in verse 10, which in times past were not a people, but now are, folks, you are the people of God. You need to stand together as people of God. Don't be alone. Get others on your side. Encourage one another. He goes on to say in verse 11, dearly beloved, I beseech you, all of you, strangers and pilgrims. Thankfully, Daniel had 3 others standing beside him right at the beginning. 3 others who also understood that they were strangers and pilgrims. He says, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Having your conversation honest, a lifestyle that's virtuous among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak evil against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Just keep doing right. We also read over in chapter 3, verse 8, finally, be all of one mind. That literally means live in harmony. Be of one mind. Are you living in harmony today with everybody else? That's what you do when persecution comes. Live in harmony. Be of one mind. Having compassion one of another. Love as brethren. Be pitiful. That means have mercy. Be courteous. Be kind. Folks, one thing the church needs, we need each other in times of persecution. Don't go it alone. You're not a lone wolf. You need Christian friends in the battle. By the way, this section goes on by telling us what not to do. Look what it says in verse 9. It says, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing, knowing that ye are thereunto called, that you'd inherit a blessing. And then we have this promise, which is something that Daniel experienced. Look at verse 10. You ready? This is something Daniel experienced, something you can experience. For he that will love life. Do you want to love life? You want to have a good life? I should let you read it at home and meditate on it, but I'll read it. He that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and eschew it. You go after the good things. Do what God says if you want to love life. And life will be good to you. God makes that promise. You know, making good friends and having good friends by your side was part of what made Daniel successful while undergoing adversity. When friends stand with you, they can help you see sometimes the wicked plans that are laid out that you can't see. For instance, the name Daniel means God is judge. Daniel, God is judge. But you know what the name they gave him was? Belteshazzar, which means may the God Bel protect my life. What Babylon was trying to do was to give God's children a new identity. You're not who your parents told you you were. You're not, do I dare say it, what your birth certificate says you are. A new identity. Get rid of the old. And that's what they were doing. They gave him a brand new name, and his friends, 3 friends likewise, were given new names. It was an attempt to throw off the remembrance of what they believed and how they were raised. as this was an attempt to separate their new life from the old life and the moral code that they had. And you know, the world wants the young people of our nation to also throw off the old codes that they learn at home. They mock the training they've received from godly parents. They try to remove the bonds and the values between the children and the parents and the church. Even though Daniel allowed himself to march hundreds of miles from his home, even though he allowed himself to be separated from his country and his family, the point where it came to take a stand was when he realized that they may be trying to change me with words and with actions, but I'm going to stand. And he had 3 friends stand with him. Praise God. The time came to resist, and he resisted. If you look over in 1 Peter 5, we're also told there's a time to resist and to look at what's going on around you. 1 Peter 5:9 says, whom resist steadfastly, talking about the devil. In the faith. Keep your faith in God. Resist the devil, knowing that the same afflictions are accomplished in your brethren that are in the world. Resist. There's a time to say no. So in Daniel 1:8 we read, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine that which he drank. He resisted wrongdoing in order to put God first and to be pure before God. And by the way, folks, to resist Nebuchadnezzar was a serious thing, just like it is to resist the devil today. If you were to look in Jeremiah 39 and 29, you'd see that Nebuchadnezzar would do some terrible things to those that would cross him. You'll read there that in 2 incidents, he took the local leaders, impaled them on a stick, and then roasted them with fire. That was Nebuchadnezzar. In another instant, even more cruel, he killed the king's family in front of the king. And then he cut up the bodies of his wife and children. And then he took the king and gouged his eyes out. So the last thing he ever saw was the slaying of his family. That was Nebuchadnezzar, folks. You didn't go against Nebuchadnezzar. He's got power. In spite of that, Daniel and his friends drew a line in the sand. And in doing so, they were saying, you may put me in your schools. You may teach me your ways in an attempt to indoctrinate me. You may call me names. But when it comes to obeying God, I'm going to obey God. You can imagine some of Daniel's fellow prisoners saying things like, Daniel, you didn't complain about going to their school. You didn't complain about being taken from your family and homeland. You're not complaining about your name being changed to the follower of a moon god. But now you're asked to eat gourmet food at the king's table. And you say, here I take my stand. What was Daniel doing? Daniel was standing where he needed to stand when it violated his moral purity before God. When that time comes for us, we too need to draw a line in the sand, just like that Christian baker and like that Christian clerk did. I will not do it. Christ made this very clear in John 17. He was praying to the Father, and he said this. He says, I have given them thy word, and the world hath hated them because they are not of the world. Folks, that's just the way it's going to be. He goes on to say, I pray not that thou shouldst take them out of the world, but that thou shouldst keep them from the evil. They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. And then he says in verse 18, as thou hast sent me into the world, even so I have sent them into the world. Folks, we're in the world. The world is around us, but the world ought not be in us. And that's what Daniel's secret was. You can do with me what you want, but you know what? When you ask me to do things that violate my conscience to God, I will not do it. Bottom line, Christians, in the near future, we may be forced to live in an increasingly sinful and evil culture. But we do not and we must not voluntarily let the culture inside of us. We must not do it. Daniel put up with the world. He endured what Babylon dealt to him, but he refused to let Babylon get inside of him. He would not let them get into his heart that belonged to God. And so he purposed in his heart to be holy or separate in all manner of conversation or lifestyle, which again is what Peter says in 1 Peter 1:14, as obedient children, don't fashion yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. But as he which has called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, all manner of life. Be separate unto me. Why? Because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. Well, that's just an introduction to the morning message, okay? Brother, I'm done. All right?